Today we're talking about standpoint theory. This is the next in our gender section here. And you'll notice that this is quite different from genderlect, because this really comes out of more of a feminist epistemology, a feminist way of understanding the world. And this is a theory that's it's a little convoluted, but we'll do our best here to really make this I'm alive. So it's called standpoint theory, and central to this theory is the idea of a standpoint, right? Or standpoints. What a standpoint is a place from which we view the world that determines what we focus on as well as what we don't know. So a standpoint is a specific location in time and space that determines how you see the world. Right, we're all a certain age, we all have a certain background, right, a familial background, we're all a certain race, we're all a certain socioeconomic status, we all have different experiences. All of this brings you to a place from which you see the world. What makes sense to you, how you understand. So if we even think of something like just a typical classroom, right? Think of all the different standpoints that are present in that classroom. Someone who's barely holding on to that class and might fail probably has a very different standpoint about that class than someone who's soaring through. A freshman might have a very different approach than a senior would, for example. Right? Like all of these things, or maybe if you have a history, if you've taken that class before, taken a class with that professor before, right? Those are all standpoints, things that go into how you view that thing. Now, social groups, right, which are those things we're talking about, like race, sexuality, ethnicity, right, like socioeconomic status, gender, those kind of things. The social groups we belong to shape how we see the world and how we communicate. Social groups tend to see the world in the same types of ways, right? That's not to say everyone within a social group is going to have the exact same standpoint, but they're going to be closer to each other. So, now the problem is, right, like if these influence how it is that we see the world, right, these social groups, are all social groups treated the same? Obviously not, right? Right, like some groups are oppressed and other groups are not. So we could think like people who are poorer might be oppressed by those who are richer, for example. Or we talked about it with the genderlect stuff. There's a feminist theory. We could say women historically have not been treated as well as men have, for example, right? Within this country, right, things are getting better, but especially pre-civil rights, right? Black folks were not treated as well as white folks. And so what we have here is we have social inequality, societal inequality, whereby some groups are treated better than others and some groups oppress others. So when our social groups influence how we see the world, and social inequality is a part of our social groups, what you're going to have is you're going to have radically different ways of seeing the world. So what we have here is, first of all, these social groups that generate distinctive accounts of how it is that the world looks. Now, what standpoint theory argues is that the perspectives from the lives of those less powerful provide a better view of the world than those who are powerful. So poor people have a better way of seeing the world than rich people, right? Or a more comprehensive way or something, right? And we're going to get to this when we get to the idea of ideal knowers here. All right, so what we know depends on what part of groups we are, right? Who you are, right? What that makeup is for you of sex, class, gender, right, socioeconomic status, race, etc. Makes up how you know the world. Now, this theory is influenced by early Marx and Engels' idea of the ideal knowers. Now, when Marx and Engels talked about it, they talked about it only in terms of class. And what standpoint theory does is it talks about it in terms of gender. So this goes back to what we're saying is that those on lower rungs, right, those in oppressed groups have better ways of seeing the world. So the reason for this, right, is Marx and Engels point to the example of like a factory owner. So a factory owner might sit on top of, right, like the pyramid in that situation, whereas there's all these people who would be working below him or her. Now, what Marx and Engels says is that person, right, has no vested interest in needing to understand the way that people, quote unquote, lower than him need to talk, right? All he needs to do is to see them as workers for him in a factory. But how about those people who are working on the assembly line in the factory, right? They need to know what people higher than them think. Why? Because they need to be able to put themselves in that person's shoes to see how it is that they look to that person. Because success for them, right? Not even success, their very livelihood, their ability to eat, put food on their table, is based on being able to give that guy what he wants. And so what we have here is these people have adopted that position, right? They've adopted that position. They can understand what the world looks like from a factory worker's perspective, right? Whereas that factory worker probably cannot understand what it's like to actually be on the ground floor working. And that's one thing that makes a good boss. A good boss is able to put him or herself in those positions, but more often than not, they're not able to. And I'm sure you notice in that language there, right, we're talking a little bit about symbolic interactionism. If you remember that we can take on the other and think how the other's thinking, that's influence in this as well. But also, standpoint theory argues that gender is socially constructed. So go back to our difference between sex and gender we talked about, hardware, software. Symbolic interaction, or not symbolic interaction, standpoint theory says that it is all constructed through society, right? That there are certainly biological differences in men and women, but most of what we do to be a man or to be a woman comes from society. And it comes from those groups, right? Those groups that we talked about, of societal groups, and they're not always treated the same. Now this is different, right? Obviously we're talking little t truths here. Standpoints are little t truths, but standpoint does not embrace relativism. Standpoint theorists do not say, hey, what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. No, right? They're saying that all we have is our locations by which to view knowledge. But that doesn't mean that anything goes. Some visions of the world are better than other visions of the world. So the problem, argues standpoint theory, is that we tend to look at scholarship from the position of the oppressor. So if you were to open a standard American history textbook, what you're likely to find are people who were very rich in that book, right? The founding fathers, all a very rich group of people. Right? And they were all white, for example, right? And they were all dudes, right? What we have here is we have a group of people who are the highest rung of the socioeconomic status and of the ladder in that situation. Now, what standpoint theorists argue is that that's actually the worst place to begin looking at what was actually going on in history. Because, remember, the perspectives from those who are lower on the totem pole encompass those perspectives from the higher up in the rung as well. So a lot of our founding fathers were slave owners, for example. What standpoint theory says, if we want to understand American history, we should start with those narratives, from those people who are marginalized. Because those people, they know, right? They know what the slave owners want, but they also have their own perspective. Right? The slave owners do not know what life is like for the slaves. And what we're doing is we're opening it up, right? So we should start from the perspective of the marginalized so we can get a better perspective, right? A more holistic way of understanding the way that something actually is. Now, standpoint theory argues, right, that the differences between men and women influence our communication. We can go back to Tannen there a little bit. That doesn't need to go on. But it's important to remember that culture is not experienced identically by all members because of inequality, right? It's not as if all women just automatically see the world the same way. So it's right. It's not. They don't want to break it into this easy category of saying men talk like this, women talk like this. The power to define is really important here, because remember, this theory relies on symbolic interactionism a little bit, and we talk about the power of naming. It shows that men have traditionally had the ability to name within society, and that indicates something, right? We talk about gatekeepers of language, and we'll talk about that in the next theory that we talk about as well. But those people at the top, right, are able to write the rules, basically. And it's important, right, once again, to not think of women as a monolithic group, right? So just because all women, right, may share some quality, right, all women are also different races, different sexual orientations, different classes, etc. And so parsing out, right, who's who in these situations gets a little difficult because we all have certain kind of allegiances to all of our different distinct social groups. But standpoint theory does argue that even though we're different, right, within our cultural groups, it's important to frame it as if we're all on the same tide. And she says this allows for political solidarity. This gets things done if you see the world in this perspective. All right, we're at about 10 minutes. I'll be right back.